So now that we're a few days into the transfer portal opening, what does LSU's roster look like coming up for next season? We'll get into that on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast. Plus, you can find us on YouTube as well. So be sure to check us out on YouTube, Locked On LSU. Hit that subscribe button and you won't miss a single second of your Locked On LSU content. My name is Caroline Fenton and I'm your host, as I am every day. I graduated from LSU. I've been covering LSU football since 2016, and I now host a sports talk radio show in Nashville, Tennessee. But let's get into it because the transfer portal is officially open. We have guys declaring for the NFL draft. And I said a couple days ago, I said, I'll have a better idea of position groups that LSU will need to target in the transfer portal once more names start to drop. And once we start to see, okay, there are roster deficiencies or roster holes at these certain positions whenever LSU players start to declare. Now, I mentioned earlier this week that Brian Kelly will be conducting exit interviews with players, and that's probably why you saw a little bit of delay for some LSU players. I think you started to see, Texas A&M players, for example, started to declare a few days ago. Colorado players, whenever Deion Sanders made his entrance into Colorado and said, hey, I suggest you guys hit the transfer portal because I'm bringing my guys in here. You started to see some LSU players trickle into the transfer portal a few days after that. But I think the biggest one so far is what we learned a couple days ago when wide receiver Jack Bech decided to enter the transfer portal. He took to Twitter, made an announcement about how much he appreciated LSU, how much LSU had done for him, but now it's time for a new beginning, and he wants to find a home elsewhere. Now, when I'm breaking down the transfer portal and when I continue to update y'all on players that enter the transfer portal, I want to remind all of you about a statement that I made last week. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case with Jack Bech or with any player in particular. I don't know what their intentions are. But one thing that I'd like to keep in mind is that the transfer portal is now going to be used like free agency in the NFL, where players might want to go and test the open market say they're into the transfer portal, test the open market, see what NIL deals are out there, what opportunities may or may not arise for these players in other programs before they make their official decision. So they may be entering the transfer portal because they really, truly just want a fresh start. And if they do, more power to them. And if they enter the transfer portal, there still could be a possibility that that player may return to LSU after testing the open market, looking at NIL deals that are out there, and realizing that, the best opportunity for income is where they are, is at LSU. I'm not saying that's the case with Jack Bech. Jack Bech has a few NIL deals with LSU. He's got to deal with Raising Cane's. He's got to deal with small sliders. He's got to deal with a workout company in Lafayette. He's been able to capitalize off of NIL. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case with Jack Bech. I'm just saying now that we're starting to have these conversations, keep that in mind. Like I mentioned, Jack Bech, wide receiver, has entered the transfer portal. Now, I was kind of surprised when I saw this move to be made. Jack Bech is from Lafayette. Jack Bech grew up a huge LSU fan. I went to school with his sisters. He comes from a long line of LSU Tigers. I know that this was his dream school and where he truly wanted to be. I know that when Brian Kelly came in this season, he took to social media and said that he was excited about the Brian Kelly era. But so I was a little bit surprised when I did see that. I was a little bit bummed when I saw it. Jack Bech is a good player. He's a good kid. Jack Bech really, truly had a breakout season in 2021 when Kayshon Boutte unfortunately went down with an injury in the middle of the season. Jack Bech emerged as Max Johnson's favorite target in Jack Bech's first season, his freshman season in 2021. Let's not forget that Jack Bech came into LSU's program as a tight end and was utilized so heavily in the passing game and showed off how much talent he has in the passing game that he transitioned into a wide receiver this year. But also, the more that I thought about it, and I looked into the fact that Jack Bech made this decision to transfer after Kayshon Boutte made his decision to come back to LSU, Jack Bech was probably looking back and thinking, this is a stacked wide receiver room. Kayshon Boutte is coming back for his senior season. Malik Nabers has really emerged this season, has had his breakout season this year. And then you look at two other 4-star wide receivers that are coming in the 2023 class, Shelton Sampson being one of them. There might not have been a spot carved out for Jack Bech. He was in and out this season with injury. He came into this season with the Achilles tear. And then we saw him kind of on and off the field all season long. He wasn't able to be on the field as much as I can only assume that he wanted to be. So I can understand that he's looking at the stacked wide receiver room. He's thinking, hey, there might not be a spot for me. He had a really good year this year. Maybe really good is an exaggeration. He had a fine year this year, considering the injuries that he was facing. 200 yards, a touchdown. I know that's not what he wanted, coming off of nearly a 500-yard season, 3 touchdowns, and a breakout year last year. And then you look at, the fumbled kickoff against Tennessee. You look at the interception against Georgia that just bounced off of his helmet. I know that this year probably didn't go how he wanted it to. Jack Bech is still a good player. He's still a good kid. I wish him nothing but the best in the future. And I know wherever he lands, wherever program he decides to go to, if it's not LSU, we'll be lucky to have him because he's a gamer. That is one thing that Brian Kelly mentioned about him earlier this season is, even if he's injured throughout the week, if he's limited in practice, he will go out there in a game and he will show out and he will show off. So, it's a big loss for LSU losing Jack Bech into the transfer portal. But that's not a position group that is going to be in short supply for LSU next season. You've got a stacked wide receiver room for 2023. So while it's a loss for LSU, losing a guy who loves LSU, losing a guy who's from Louisiana, losing a guy with a ton of talent, no doubt there's still plenty of depth in that wide receiver room next year. But a couple more pieces that LSU will lose on the other side of the ball. We'll get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about LinkedIn Jobs. So these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high stakes wager for your small business. And you want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. So that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. So for my company that I work for a radio station, and we're looking to kind of change things up for the new year. So what's going to help us do that? We're going to find some new talent. We're going to find some new people that can come in and bring in some fresh ideas, but we don't want to waste any time searching through people that really don't have the qualifications that we're looking for. Luckily for us, LinkedIn Jobs takes all of the guessing work, takes all of that time because LinkedIn has simple tools like screening questions that make it super easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you would like to interview and hire. And it's super easy to do so. Just go to LinkedIn, add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you are hiring. Let LinkedIn do the hard work for you. It's why small businesses rank LinkedIn Jobs the #1 tool in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen today. So for your second listen today, check out Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. So we learned Jack Bech will enter the transfer portal. He has been kind of a foundational piece for this offense. Unfortunately, he hasn't been able to reach his potential due to injury. But another player, a foundational piece that has contributed a ton to this team so far this season, who will not be part of the LSU Tigers in 2023. And it's not due to the transfer portal. And that is Jay Ward, defensive back, who announced earlier this week that he will declare for the NFL draft. And I mean, good for Jay Ward. He had 1 year of eligibility left. This was his 4th year as an LSU Tiger. He came in 2019, but he had that extra COVID year. So he could have come back for his extra year of eligibility, but has elected to enter the NFL draft. And he has accepted an invitation to participate in the Reese's Senior Bowl in Mobile in a couple weeks. Good for him. Good for Jay Ward. He's a good player. And I think the key here with Jay Ward is his versatility. I don't see Jay Ward as a first round guy, maybe not even a second round guy. But there's a team out there that's going to need some defensive back depth. And that's what Jay Ward brings to the table is versatility in the defensive backfield. He can play corner. He's one of those long-bodied, really strong corners. That he can play that position, but he can also transition into the safety position as well. He primarily played safety with LSU, but can kind of transition into safety in the cornerback positions. So Jay Ward will enter the NFL draft, and he has made some really key plays for LSU and throughout his entire tenure. I mean, let's not forget he had 2 interceptions against Ole Miss and contributed a big time to that win over Ole Miss in 2020. Looking more recently, the blocked field goal against Arkansas, and that was a game where every single point mattered. I mean, that was a difference in the game. LSU won that game 13-10. Without Jay Ward's contributions, that game is a lot more nerve-wracking and a lot more interesting than it needed to be. And if you watch that game, it was already interesting and it was already way more nerve-wracking than it needed to be. So he's been able to make big plays. And even though he's not the flashiest of defensive backs, even though he's not one of those guys that when you look at the history of LSU and you think DBU, Jay Ward's probably not going to be one of those guys that you think of, but he has made key plays. He's been a good player for LSU. He's been a versatile player for LSU. And he's going to be a loss, but he's going to provide a lot of depth and versatility for any NFL team that decides to pick him up. But it was reported by Jacques Doucet earlier today as well that he will still participate in the Citrus Bowl, which is great for this LSU team. But another player in the defensive backfield to kind of keep your eye on, it hasn't been announced officially. At least it hasn't, this player hasn't taken to Twitter or announced that they will enter the NFL draft. But Mekhi Garner, it was announced today that he has accepted an invitation to play in the East-West Shrine game. And I don't know how familiar you are with the East-West Shrine game, but that's along the same lines as the Reese's Senior Bowl. It's an opportunity for draft eligible players to show off their talent to NFL draft scouts, to NFL scouts, and to kind of make a name for themselves if they haven't already. So Mekhi Garner has accepted an invitation, and I can only assume that's because he will enter the NFL draft this year. He is draft eligible. So that's another player to watch. Probably see that announcement coming in. Could be hours. It could be a matter of days, but I have to assume that Mekhi Garner will enter the NFL draft, given that he has accepted an invitation to the East-West Shrine game. But those are 2 defensive backs, and Jay Ward and Mekhi Garner, that have each contributed to this team this year that LSU will not have coming up next year. And then you look at Jarrick Bernard-Converse, Mekhi Garner, who I just mentioned, Colby Richardson, Greg Brooks, they are all draft eligible. Joe Foucha is a super senior. He has exhausted his eligibility. So you look at Joe Foucha, Greg Brooks, who can come back for his super senior year, for his 5th year. You could lose a whole lot of defensive back depth coming up in the next few months and weeks. Defensive back was a position of need going into this season. And Brian Kelly and company had done a very good job of addressing that need in the transfer portal. Greg Brooks and Joe Foucha and Jarrick Bernard-Converse, 3 of which were pieces that Brian Kelly brought in through the transfer portal. Veteran guys with experience, whether it be in the SEC or the Big 12 or elsewhere in college football, these players had experience. And that's what this team needed, was veteran players with experience. But now they're going to have to go out and replace that talent, that experience. So look at that to be one position of need for LSU coming up in the transfer portal is defensive back depth. And coming up in tomorrow's episode, I will highlight exactly who I think could be a fit for LSU, players who have entered the transfer portal that could be fits for LSU to bring in this defensive backfield. And LSU is bringing in a good bit of talent defensively in the 2023 class. You look at mostly, on the defensive line, but they're bringing in Dalen Austin, a 4-star corner out of California, who if LSU can hold on to Dalen Austin, that has kind of been The buzz around the recruiting circles is that Dalen Austin may still be looking around and may not be completely committed to LSU. But for right now, Dalen Austin coming in the 23 class, Kylan Jackson, a local kid, Zachary High School, a 4-star safety. I feel pretty secure in that commitment. And you also look at Ryan Yates, a kid out of Texas, another 4-star, who is, the 47th ranked recruit out of Texas. All of those players are coming in the 23 class, which is invaluable depth to add to a position group that needs depth, but you're also looking for those veteran players as well. LSU has been very successful with their true freshmen who have played this season, but you need those veteran players as well. So I look to the defensive back position to be one area in particular that LSU will address in the transfer portal. But again, Jay Ward entering the NFL draft, Mekhi Garner. By the time I'm recording this podcast on Thursday night, Mekhi Garner has not made the official announcement that he has entered the transfer, that he will declare for the NFL draft. But since he's going to the East West Shrine game, I can only assume that announcement will come very, very soon. And coming up next, I want to highlight some other players that have entered the transfer portal. It's not just Jack Bech. It's not just Jay Ward and Mekhi Garner who will not be joining the LSU Tigers in 2023, but some other players who may not be as much of household names, but will be exiting LSU for the 2023 season, or at least has declared to do so. We will get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about Bet Online. BetOnline.net is one of my favorite places to get sports betting information, stats, news, and analysis. That's the best part about BetOnline, is it's not just a place to wager, it's not just a place to bet, but it's also a place to become a smarter football fan. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, and it's not just football. They've got basketball, soccer, esports, all on betonline.net. So if you love sports podcasts, you can find those on betonline.net as well. Articles, stats, like I mentioned, you can find those on BetOnline. It's the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. So head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, so Jack Bech entering the transfer portal, but there's also another handful of players who will enter the transfer portal as well. And again, things change by the second in this transfer portal era, now that the transfer portal is open. So by the time you're listening to this podcast, things may have changed. Players may have decided to stay, players may have decided to enter the transfer portal, but I promise you throughout the next coming weeks while the transfer portal is open, I will try to update y'all as much as possible. But Raydarius Jones is another player that has entered the transfer portal, a junior cornerback, adding to another player that will kind of deplete the depth on the defensive back room for LSU. But this wasn't a move that was incredibly surprising to me. He was suspended in 2022 for academic reasons. But in 2021, he had 9 tackles. He had 1 PBU. He played in 4 games in 2021. Raydarius Jones has not been a cornerstone for this team. It's expected. It was not surprising to me to see Raydarius Jones enter the transfer portal, but he has announced that he will do that. Damarius McGhee, another corner, just to add to the number of defensive backs that won't be with LSU in 2023. He's a redshirt sophomore. He played in 1 game in 2022. In 2021, he played in 12 games and in the Texas Bowl. He had 5 tackles on the season in 2021. So Damarius McGhee, another player that probably isn't a household name, isn't a player that you see pop up on the stat sheet very frequently, but is another player that has entered the transfer portal. Another player that really has contributed a good bit for LSU this season is linebacker Colby Fields. He announced on Thursday that he will enter the transfer portal, and he transferred this. He's technically considered a redshirt freshman for LSU, but he played in his first season last year in 2021 at South Carolina. He entered the transfer portal, landed at LSU for his redshirt freshman season. He played in 11 games. He had 4 tackles on the year and is looking for something else. I can only assume. Just seeing as though how little production Colby Fields had at LSU, it's not a surprise to me that he is looking elsewhere, considering how much just linebacker talent this team has and how much linebacker talent will continue to come in. And the fourth and final player that has entered the transfer portal, at least by the time that I'm recording this, because I promise y'all things change in a flash. Desmond Little, an edge rusher, has also most recently decided to enter the transfer portal. Not a bad player at all. This was actually Desmond Little was one player that I was excited to see gain a little bit of seniority and work his way up the depth chart because he played in 7 games this season, 14 games so far in his LSU career. I believe he played in 5 in 2021 and 2 in 2020. So he's been earning a lot more playing time. 2 games in 2020, 5 games in 2021, 7 games in 2022. He had 16 tackles and 2.5 sacks on the year this year. I mean, I thought that Desmond Little was going to be a player that earned his way into more playing time. And I thought that he had done that this year. But he has also entered the transfer portal. So a lot of defensive talent leaving LSU's program. And that will be one area in particular. I mentioned defensive backs, but really defensively as a whole. LSU could use some defensive line depth. LSU could use a whole lot of defensive back depth. So to see an edge rusher and to see a bunch of defensive backs leave this program, I think is going to point toward where Brian Kelly goes next, where they look in the transfer portal to bring in some depth at those positions that will be leaving LSU in the transfer portal. But again, like I mentioned, Jack Bech, wide receiver, junior corner, Raydarius Jones, redshirt sophomore corner, Damarius McGhee, linebacker Colby Fields, Desmond Little, edge rusher, leaving LSU in the transfer portal. Jay Ward has already declared for the NFL draft. He will play in the bowl game, and then he'll be at the Reese's Senior Bowl. And then Mekhi Garner is one that we are going to keep an eye on as well. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now, like I mentioned, coming up in tomorrow's podcast, I will highlight the positions of need that LSU needs to go shopping for in the transfer portal and some potential names that could be fits for LSU. We'll get into that on tomorrow's podcast. But make your second listen the Locked On Sports Today podcast. The biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. That's available in the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts.